Close your eyes. Imagine a desert. Not the one from tourist brochures, not the one from movies about Moses, a real one. A desert that is hot, loud, full of dust and sand that gets into your mouth, your eyes, your memory. Now imagine a stone from Jerusalem. It's been lying there for thousands of years. It lay there when the temple burned. It lay there when the crusaders fought, when the caliphate was born, when the British marched in. It lies there, and it watches. And now, just a few years ago, that same stone watched a new era arrive. An era in which politics is done on Instagram, and prophecies come with a campaign logo. This is not a story about the Bible, this is a story about branding. About how you can turn holiness into a product. Complete with a loyalty program, a spiritual investor certificate, and a special offer on votes. Because what Donald Trump did was not a theological revolution. It was an election campaign dressed up in a halo. He didn't read scripture. He didn't know the history of Jerusalem. But he knew something most politicians didn't: the value of emotion in religious marketing. He knew that for millions of Americans, Israel is not just a country. It's a signal of the end times, a signal of salvation, a signal that says, he stood on God's side. And it only took one sentence, one signature, one move of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and suddenly the whole world stopped talking about a peace agreement. It started talking about a miracle. But that miracle had a price. Not in dollars, in human lives, in the wounded, in buried chances, in the frustration of an entire generation of Palestinians who saw, once again, that their future was being decided by someone who didn't know their names, but knew perfectly well the surnames of their opponents. In this episode, there will be no happy end. There will be no clear heroes either. Because Israel is not just a bastion of democracy. Palestine is not just a conflict zone. And the United States is neither savior nor enemy. This is the story of a spiritual transaction carried out in front of the whole world. With a president, a pastor, a billionaire, a son-in-law, and a nation that was meant to stay silent because it wasn't invited to the table. Let's begin. This is not a story about religion. It's a story about a deal that started in the desert and ended in a skyscraper with a marble bathroom. It's the story of how Donald Trump entered the holy city, not in sandals, but in polished dress shoes, with a teleprompter and a donor certificate signed by American Christians. Let's start with an image: the desert. The heated sky over Judea, the sound of prayers echoing off the walls of the old city. In the shadow of the Dome of the Rock, cameras, lights, microphones. The world is watching because something is about to happen that no U.S. president has ever dared to do. He walks in. Donald J. Trump, red tie, the gravity of a preacher, and the swagger of a real estate developer. He announces, "We recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and we are moving our embassy there. For Israel, a blessing. For the Palestinians, a slap in the face. For the world, a shock. For Trump, the perfect deal." But it didn't start in Jerusalem. It started much earlier, in America, in the South, in the Bible Belt. Among people who don't trust the government but trust God. Among those who believe that Israel is not just a country, but a sign that the end of days is near. You see, in the United States, there is a powerful block of voters, millions of evangelical Christians who believe that before Jesus can return, Israel must be restored. It must have Jerusalem. It must have the temple. This is not a theory. This is politics. And these are votes. Millions of votes. Donald Trump didn't know the Bible. When asked once about his favorite verse, he answered, "All of them. I like all of them equally." But he knew what sells. He knew Jerusalem is a magic button for this group. Press it, and you get everything. Loyalty, donations, prayers, and above all, votes. Trump didn't enter politics like a politician. He entered it like a salesman. He knew every nation has its religion, and every religious myth can be monetized. For Israel, he was a savior. For American Christians, Cyrus, the Persian king who 2,500 years ago allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. That's what they started calling him. Trump as the new Cyrus. Not a joke. Serious preaching. Behind this spectacle stood Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, an Orthodox Jew from New York whose family funded Israeli charities and lobbied for closer Tel Aviv-Washington ties. Jared is not a politician. He's a dealmaker. He had one goal: deliver the deal of the century between Israel and its Arab neighbors. And he did, but we'll get to that later. Back to Trump. He wasn't acting in a vacuum. Next to him stood Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, a man with a huge past and an even bigger appetite for power. When Trump announced recognition of Jerusalem, Netanyahu applauded, not only for the symbolism. This was political ammunition. Israel was heading into an election. And Trump had just handed him something more powerful than billions of dollars, a messianic certificate. And then something more started. Not just a political shift, a narrative revolution. Trump, Netanyahu, and American pastors created a new religious media mythology. In this story, there was no room for nuance. Either you're with us or against God. Jerusalem became a meme, the embassy a symbol, and the President of the United States a chosen instrument. On YouTube, sermons began to circulate in which Trump was called God's tool. On Twitter, you could see graphics with him glowing in a halo. Pastors like John Hagee declared that no leader has ever done so much for Israel. And most importantly, nobody asked for anything in return, just votes and gratitude. Was it cynical? Maybe. Was it effective? No question. Trump won around 80% of the evangelical vote. For them, his language didn't matter. His sins didn't matter. What mattered was that he had touched Israel, that he stood with the chosen people. But this wasn't just an American story. It was a global one. Because when Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem, the world shifted tracks. Syrians, Jordanians, Europeans, everyone watched. Palestinians declared days of rage. The European Union expressed deep concern. The United Nations called an emergency meeting. But Trump didn't back down, because he wasn't operating in the world of diplomacy. He was operating in the world of marketing. And marketing loves simplicity. Good, evil, light, darkness, God, enemy. That's how this story begins. Not with prophecy, with a campaign, not with revelation, with calculation, and not with love for Israel, but with the realization that Israel is the perfect product. Holiness, martyrdom, heroism, survival. Every one of these can be turned into capital, media capital, political capital, emotional capital. And Trump, more than anyone before him, knew how to cash it in. In the next episodes, we'll go deeper. We'll look at documents. We'll listen at the doors of lobbyists. We'll hear Americans sing hymns about Jerusalem without knowing where it is on the map. We'll show you the Holy Land as seen from a satellite and from inside a campaign war room. But one thing is already clear. Israel in the era of Trump became not only an ally, it became a stage of a political miracle. They said it was a miracle, that God had guided Donald Trump's pen. But this miracle cost just one decision, 3 signatures, and dozens of wounded. Not counting those who can't be counted, those wounded symbolically, in their map, their dignity, their future. It was the 6th of December, 2017, the day global politics stopped in a place that hasn't known peace for 2,000 years. And that's precisely where Trump decided to plant the American embassy, in the very heart of an emotional nuclear bomb. This wasn't an urban planning project. It was a theological project, because when the U.S. Embassy moves from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the world doesn't see a building. It sees an act of faith and an act of war. In Washington, euphoria. In Jerusalem, celebration. In Ramallah, funerals. And that was the point. It had to be clear. Thick lines, good, evil. Truth, betrayal. Trump didn't do nuance. His map had no shades of geopolitics. It had only, this is ours. David Friedman was the architect of that decision, not of the building, of the narrative. A man who once defended the Trump organization from bankruptcy was now defending Trump's place in Jewish history. Friedman is not a diplomat. He's a man of faith. His faith, and his influence. But the real scriptwriter was Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, the silent demiurge of this story. He created a plan that didn't include Palestine, only a piece that looked like a hostile takeover. On TV, it was called a promise fulfilled. In Arab neighborhoods, sacrilege. In Washington, the deal of the century. But in the streets of Gaza, tires burned. Not because of the embassy's new address, because of what it meant. Jerusalem is not like other cities. It's a place where every stone has its own religion and every brick has two owners. Moving the embassy there is like placing a grenade in the chest of a praying person. But Trump saw it differently. He saw crowds, he saw cheers, he saw polling numbers. That's when everyone understood. This wasn't a diplomatic decision. It was a campaign decision, conducted in the language of prophets, because Trump didn't say it was right. He said it was destined, and the crowd bought it. For votes, for dollars, for salvation. Because in the American South, where preachers have more power than professors, Israel is not a partner. It's a condition for Christ's return. That's why the embassy became a chapel. For millions of people, this wasn't a change of address. It was a seal for eternity. But on the other side of the barricade, Palestinians in Gaza were dying from live fire. Over 60 killed. On the day of the embassy opening, no one mentioned it in the opening speeches. There was no mourning. Only smiles, speeches, and God bless America. Because in this script, the other side was never part of the plan. This was an act of faith and an act of show. Because the embassy wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new language, a language of transactional holiness, where borders are symbolic and symbols carry a market price. And now, when the building stands, the flag flies. The marble reflects the setting sun. Only one question remains. Is Trump's embassy really just a building? Or is it, as some say, a new temple? Built not of stone, but of political marketing? She doesn't see an embassy. She sees the death of her dream, or maybe the birth of another one. One in which there is no room for compromise, only for decisions, written in bold, with a full stop. Like this. Jerusalem. What does the Promised Land look like in Donald Trump's eyes? The Holy Land has many definitions. For Jews, a place of promise. For Palestinians, a place of memory. For Christians, a stage for prophecies. And for Donald Trump, a development plot. Not that he wanted to buy it, he wanted to restructure it, so that everyone would get something. But not everything, because happy Arabs don't look good on a campaign poster in Texas. And so a plan appeared. A plan that was supposed to change everything. Peace to prosperity. Sounds like the name of a bank. And that's how it was meant to work. Jared Kushner, the face of Harvard, the soul of a real estate developer, the president's son-in-law, Ivanka's husband, an Orthodox Jew, but above all, a man who had never been to war. And now he was supposed to solve a conflict older than the United States itself. But he didn't start with borders, he started with slides. Because in his mind, peace doesn't depend on history. It depends on Excel. What did the plan not contain? A Palestinian state, the right of return for refugees, sovereignty over Jerusalem. What did it offer instead? The promise of billions, investments, roads, tunnels, ports, and one silent request. Stop talking about freedom. Start talking about the economy. The problem was that this future was drawn without one side's consent. Palestinians weren't even invited to the table because the table was reserved for sponsors, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Bahrain. Trump called, persuaded, reminded them of arms deals. 2 magic words, Iran and business. That was the moment when the Promised Land became the calculated land. Measured in meters, percentages, geolocation. Trump didn't want to be a prophet. He wanted to be a broker selling eternity with a Sea-View peace package. But for Palestinians, this vision was like a notary telling you, you're entitled to half the room, just without the keys. In Ramallah, the plan was called a joke. In Gaza, an insult. In Bethlehem, a new colonial blueprint. But in the United States, for many evangelicals, it was another step toward prophecy, because they don't care about a Palestinian state. They care that Israel expands. Only then, Jesus returns. Yes, really. And that's what the prophecy looked like. Turned into a PDF, signed by Trump. Without a second signature, the promised land according to Donald? Not a myth, a borderless map. You can print as many copies as you like. And if someone asks, did the Palestinians agree? The answer is simple. You don't have to ask those who have no options. How do you hand out land that isn't yours? There are places that look safe. Only when you look through a rifle scope do you realize it's an illusion. The Golan Heights, a strip of land that looks like a wild patch of the Scottish Highlands, but is one of the most strategic points in the region. On one side, Syria. On the other, Israel. And in between, a history that never had time to heal. In 1967, Israel took the Golan from Syria during the Six-Day War. In 1981, it formally annexed it. And for decades, nobody recognized that. Not the UN, not the US, not even a part of the Jewish world. Until Trump came along. It was March 2019. Netanyahu, in the middle of a heated election campaign. Trump, under fire over Russiagate, the perfect moment to change the subject, and then Trump did something no one had dared to do before. He recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israel, officially, in black ink, with one signature. Not because he'd done a geopolitical assessment, not because he'd met Syrian refugees, he did it because he could. And because he knew Netanyahu would turn it into the campaign of his life. For Israel, it was like a kiss from heaven. For Syria, betrayal. For the international community, shock. For American evangelicals, a prophecy fulfilled on live TV. It wasn't a gift for Israel, it was a gift for Netanyahu. Timed for the election, wrapped in the Bible, tied with a ribbon printed with the stars and stripes. Netanyahu had a problem. Corruption scandals, protests, falling poll numbers, and then, like out of a catalog of political miracles, Trump arrives. Here you go, Bibi. Territory. Just say it's thanks to me. And so Trump Heights was born, a new settlement in the Golan. In name, because in reality, there is almost nothing there. A few prefab houses, some flags, a couple of goats. But the name is right, and that's what matters. It's not a settlement, it's a monument of gratitude. The problem is, the world didn't buy the narrative. France, Germany, Russia all said, we don't recognize it. The UN reminded everyone the Golan is occupied land. And Syria? Well, Syria had bigger problems. War, ruins, Russian troops. But it still wrote it down as another nail. Because when you redraw maps without asking the people living on them, that's not reform. That's rebranded colonialism. But Trump and Netanyahu knew one thing. Symbols work faster than international law. And Golan was the perfect symbol. High, visible, valuable. The heights became part of a narrative. Israel expands. Palestine shrinks. The world watches. Trump acts. But that narrative only worked for one side. The side that owned the printer. And had a friend in the White House. Because land is not just land. It's memory. It's identity. It's the story of what is ours. And who gets to define ours. For Trump, Golan was a deal. For Netanyahu, an election boost. For history, another stamp on a piece of paper that might one day explode. Because when you sign off on land as if it were a development contract, you have to expect that someday someone will come to reclaim it with a gun. Deal of the century or joke of the century. There were the Oslo Accords, there were the Camp David talks, hundreds of pages of analysis, treaties, compromises, and then there was Jared's PDF, grandly titled Peace to Prosperity. It was supposed to write Donald Trump into history as the man who ended the world's oldest modern conflict. Instead, it became a symbol of how deeply you can misunderstand a conflict you're involved in. Trump and his son-in-law created something that looked like a peace plan, but in reality was a manifesto of modern colonialism. With a redrawn map, without consultation, with an offer that sounded like, take it or leave it. And a clause that said, Don't say you didn't get a chance. Palestine can become a state if it has no army, no control over its borders, no capital in Jerusalem, no right of return for refugees, no right to anything without Israel's approval. It was a call center plan. Half an hour of talking about benefits. At the end, a tiny asterisk. Offer not valid for Arab customers. Jared didn't understand one thing. This wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a living wound. And you don't heal wounds with Excel charts. This wasn't dialogue. It was a presentation. One speaks, the other is supposed to listen. And if he doesn't, it means he doesn't want peace. Because this wasn't about peace, it was about the picture, the show, the moment that would look good in a campaign ad, and about Jared, who for a moment got to feel like Moses with PowerPoint. Plan of the century? For whom? For Netanyahu? Yes, he got all of Jerusalem, all the settlements, and the world's silence. For Trump? Of course. He got headlines, applause, a pastor from Alabama saying Donald was chosen by God. For Palestinians? It was a plan to erase their dream, in a glossy version, with the White House logo and a PDF that smelled of ink, not justice. Trump said, "This is a plan for those who want peace, not war." He forgot to add that it's a plan you can accept only if you first accept your own defeat, and that's how the first act of this transaction ends. Not the one between nations, the one between souls, between religion and politics, between a vote cast in Tennessee and a shot fired in Gaza. Donald Trump hasn't read the Torah. He hasn't walked Jerusalem like a pilgrim. He walked it like a CEO, like a player, like someone who understands one thing. In the age of images, only one thing counts: who signs first, and he signed. And the world, which had negotiated carefully for decades, suddenly went silent. Because something happened no one had done before. The definition of the sacred was changed, from sacrum to branding. The embassy in Jerusalem wasn't an endpoint, it was the start of a new era, an era in which any building can be an act of faith, and any decision, a media project. The Golan? Not for peace, for the headline. The peace plan? Not for agreement, for a soundbite on CNN and a sermon in Arizona. And then we saw the real goal, not to build peace, not to deliver justice, but to create an image you can show on screen. And that won't force anyone into compromise. Because in this world, compromise is weakness, and the only currency is loyalty. But on the other side, there were no teleprompters, no flashbulbs, there were tears, and burning tires at the fence. There was that emptiness you feel when you look at a place that was supposed to be yours and see marble with someone else's emblem. For some, this was the deal of the century. For others, the funeral of the century. For Netanyahu, a campaign blessing. For evangelicals, prophecy confirmed. For Palestinians, erasure from the map, and no one asked them because they weren't invited. Because, as the document says, their consent was not a necessary condition. This was not a peace plan. It was a plan of silence. And then came the hardest questions. Can you sanctify land no one understands anymore? Can you call someone chosen because they clicked Move Embassy? Can you do politics in a place where people still visit their children's graves? Can you plan the future by erasing someone's past? If you feel that what you heard today opened your eyes, let us know. Leave a comment. Subscribe, share it, not because it helps the algorithm, but because it helps awareness. Every click is a vote, and every vote is a choice. Who gets the microphone, and whose stories will be told. Because on this side of the microphone, we're here to speak also for those no one asks anymore. We'll see you in the next episode. But don't keep this story to yourself, because borders don't always run between states. Sometimes they run between truth and PR.